So we're back with part 2 of lesson 11. It's our first Angular lesson, and I'll maybe just sort of pause for a minute for people to find the stream and join back in. Maybe just throw a comment in the YouTube comment box, letting me know you're back. Yes, I misspelled the word no. Okay. Hi, Blair. I'll maybe just wait for another minute or two so that people who are hoping to follow along in real time don't get left behind. Actually, maybe now would be a good time for me to address the question that you brought up just before we took a break. So if I go back to my browser tab in Firefox, so my browser tab didn't get updated. The content here, the title variable got updated inside the HTML, but you raised the issue of the browser tab. That's a good question. So where does that come from? It's not actually set, if we look, not actually set in the individual page. So remember, the page itself is embedded inside of this component, and this component is embedded in our index.html. So the index.html is basically serving as our template. So the title's actually hard-coded in here. Now, we could try to change this to use our title variable, kind of like we've done, we did previously. Oh, hi, guys. Welcome back. We can see if that will work. So let's try that. So maybe in our index.html, so this is this is inside of, not inside the app folder, but inside source. Here's my index.html. Let's see what happens if we replace this with our title variable. So right away, and again, here's where kind of Angular comes in. It tells us at runtime, yet it's not aware of what that title variable means in this case. So we're probably not going to be able to use a variable here. Now we can change the title, but we'll be changing it, we'll be hard coding it. So I'll just call it, lesson 11. This is largely why this is seen as a single page application, because we're not really navigating from one page to another. Any pages we make are just embedded in the body of this main layout container. If I save that, again, by the time I go back to my browser, I don't even have to do a refresh. When I make that change, Angular automatically restarts and my page is automatically reloaded for me. And now you can see the title is here. Morning, Ian. Thanks for joining us. So what we want to do is we basically want to replace, we don't want all of this stuff showing up on our homepage. What we're going to do is we want to generate our own component. And that's going to create a TypeScript code file. It's also going to create an HTML template for that page along with a matching CSS file. And we want to show, for example, let's say we want to show a food item. So we'll sort of mock up. Next week, we'll build our full global food app. But this week, we'll just mock it up by hard coding some data in. So what we want is basically to run this command, this ng generate component, and then we're going to create a name for our component. So we're going to call that component food. So we're basically going to run this command. So inside of my terminal, so bear with me for a sec. I just want to make sure. So I think we need to go inside of our src and app folder. We don't want the component created in the root. We want the component created in here inside of our Angular app. So I'm going to do cd src / app. So I want to create this component in here. But now I can run this command, ng generate component. And we'll call it food. So just like we got a series of files here that start with the word app, we're going to get a series of files that start with the word food. So ng generate component food, and again, I'm inside of my source app directory. So this now creates if we refresh, now inside our app, we have a subfolder called food. And in here, we get the component file, the Angular component with TypeScript, and an HTML and a CSS document. Now, all these are empty. There's nothing here. It does actually write in here, though, food works. So we get a little bit of content in here. So again, there was my command. It was ng generate component food. And I did that from inside my source and app directory. Now I don't see any changes here. And the reason for this is our index.html. It's still displaying our original component, the app component that Angular scaffolded for us. So in our index.html, it's showing our app root here. So I want to replace this app root tag. If I go and look at my food component TypeScript file, right, it's created a component with the selector app-food. So on my index.html, I'm going to replace the app root tag. Instead, I want the app food component here. So when I save this change and go back, now notice it's interesting. Our food page, it's supposed to say food works, but we don't actually see that. So we're going to need to do one more thing in order to get this page to show up. So here's our component. We'll come back and look at this in a little more carefully. So we have to do one more thing in order to get our food page to show up. And that's in this inside of app. We've got app module.ts. I'm going to open that up. So in here, we've got some import. So Angular doesn't use the require function that Node uses. It uses import. So it's got a browser module because Angular apps don't have to run in a browser. They can run on mobile. So we want a platform browser. We're linking to the Angular core. We're doing routing for handling HTTP requests, and it's linked to our two components. So this one was here, and then when we generated our food component, it's also automatically been imported. And they're declared here. But what we're missing, notice here's the issue, our bootstrap. So what this is telling Angular is which component is the default component. So what I want to do is change this from my app component to my food component. So we want this one to be our default component. And like in Node, our class is exported, it's made public. So it's available to the rest of the application. So by changing the bootstrap in my app.module.ts, now when our index loads, it can find our food component. Now there's no CSS here. So again, we did two things. We generated the component inside of source and app. And then I modified the app.module.ts to bootstrap to make our food component the first component here. Now actually, I'm just going to see, sure if I'm allowed to do this, what happens if I keep app component. Yeah, I didn't think so. Okay, so it actually is going to let me load both of them. But notice with our app component there first, food doesn't load. So we just want our food component. We're not going to use the app component. And notice it's automatically refreshing. Now, our food component comes with its own style sheet. So we could, if we wanted to, we could put some CSS here. Again, the notion with Angular is we're probably not creating a whole series of different pages. So we don't necessarily need a global style sheet. So I'm good. We can have one if we want one, but we're going to be using this to build a single page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the app.component.css. Sorry, no, that should have styles in it, but it doesn't. All the CSS is actually here in app.component.html. So let's open up that file, and we've got several hundred lines of CSS. So what I'm going to do is actually copy from line 11. I'm going to copy all of this CSS. So again, I'm in app.component.html. I'm copying all of the CSS from line 11 down to line 298, everything inside the opening and closing style tags. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to paste it into my food component CSS. So that way we can use all of these styles in the new food.component.html page we've just created. So I'm going to paste it in. I don't need to do it, but if I save that style sheet, again, we're in food.component.css. And now you can see the font has actually changed. So the CSS, I mean, we don't really need most of those classes, but the CSS has actually changed. So again, I went into app.component.html and I copied from line 11, including line 11, everything inside my style tag, basically, my opening, closing. So starting at line 11, all the way down to line 298, I took all that CSS. So I could apply a couple of the styles. So for example, where I have this, I could use this span tag. So maybe instead of P, I'm going to change this. I'm going to change it from saying food works to Angular global food market. We'll see what that style does to it. Not much. Maybe inside of this inside of the highlight card. I think that'll give it a blue background with white text. So I'm actually going to copy that from line 321. I'm just playing around a little bit with the styles, not critical. Right, so that's what I wanted. I wanted the blue background with the white. So I've just copied line 321. I'll leave my code up for a minute so you can see it. So I've copied the default CSS to my food component.css, and now in my food component.html, we can use some of those classes. So I'll leave this up for a second. You can play around with the CSS as you like. But I want to go back and look at our food component a bit more. See what's here. So it also uses the Angular core. It uses a couple of classes in there. It inherits from the component class. It also implements the initialize method. So we can run code anytime this component is initialized. So in our declaration, we've got this @component. So here's our selector. So this is basically our custom HTML tag that will render this component. And we see that on our index.html on line 11. There's our app food. So that means inject. We're using dependency injection. We talked about this last semester when we did unit testing with ASP.NET. We are injecting the components at runtime. And then we've got a template URL. So this is where the HTML content for this component is rendered. And this is where, by default, the CSS is going to come from. If you wanted to make, so we do have a global style sheet here. There is a styles.css. It's empty. If we wanted to make global styles to be shared among multiple HTML pages, we could print them in, put them in here, and then we could change the style URL in our component tag to point to that kind of global style sheet. So we have an empty constructor method. So if there's any startup code, anything we want, or parameters we want passed to this component when it runs. And then we have this empty right now, this onInit method. So what should happen? So for example, one of the things we're going to want to do next week is whenever our food component is initialized, we want to query the database and go and fetch the list of food so that we can automatically display it. So we'll use that onInit method to run some database interaction code right away. We don't want the user to have to click a button to get the food. As soon as this page loads and the component's invoked, we should be pulling the data from MongoDB and rendering it in the page. Okay, so let's do some work inside of our class. So we've got a But we're not going to use, I said node, but what we're going to do is let's create an example of a food. Whoops, sorry. So in here, we can define, the parameters. So in our food, we'll have an ID, which is going to be a number. We'll have a name property, which will be a string. And we also have a country property, which is a string. So what we want to do is we'll create a new food or a food item. I'm going to have to move this around a little bit, so you'll have to bear with me. Okay. Sorry, bear with me for just a second. We wanted to create a new food item, but I think I've done it in the wrong place. So just give me 1 second to check something. Just going to compare it to a previous component I did. Okay. Okay. Sorry, let me undo for a moment. We'll just put our component back to the way it was. So our food will have an ID, a name, and a country. String. Okay, so we'll put this up above. We're going to basically creating a model. That defines food. And then in our component, we will create a sample food. So we'll say food item. And it's strongly typed, so we're creating an instance of our food class. And we can populate the values. Give it an ID of 1. Give it a name, and we'll give it a country. And unlike in Node where I have the option to leave my curly braces out, I don't. I must use the curly braces. So we're creating an instance of a food and populating the ID, name, and country properties. Okay, and it doesn't want any white space. So I've added lines 4 to 8 and lines 17 to 22. What this will allow me to do is now display this food item property in our HTML. So first we'll display one food item, and then instead of creating one sample food item, we'll create a list of, say, 3. So in my food component, I want to display the food item's name property, and let's say in an H2 tag. So notice my code editor recognizes this food item. And now it recognizes the name, or if I wanted, I could put out the country. I'm going to display this name of the food item. So again, I didn't have to refresh. Angular restarts automatically. So you can see that the data is going to get passed through our component and then displayed using our handlebars tags in our front end. So this is a simple example where we defined what a food looks like, and then I've created one sample food item. So this is a start. What we'd like to do is actually create a list rather than displaying one food item. I want to create a list of 3 food items, use Angular, use a loop to render them as a list, and then also be able to select a food item potentially and display the details of that food item in a form. So we can see sort of the full power, some of the full power of Angular in terms of creating a dynamic UI. So I'm going to go back to my component. We're going to keep this, our model. But what I want to do is, instead of creating one item, I want to create an array of foods instead. So I'm going to add 3 foods to this. So I'm going to rename this. So I'm going to rewrite this. I'm going to use a constant and call it foods in uppercase. And this will be equal to, rather than a single food, it's going to be an array. And we typically we're going to actually define that up here. We're going to create a list of foods. I know there's an error down below. That's okay. We'll fix that. Our foods is an array of food objects. Whoops, I'm sorry. Let me fix the syntax. So our array is declared in square brackets. And then in here we have another set of square brackets. I'm going to create 3 food items. That will be my first food item. I'll give each one a unique ID. You can put in any food items you like. So I'm creating an array with 3 food items inside it. Each food item gets an ID property, a name property, and a country property. Okay, so I've left the food class at the top. These are outside of the component. And then we're populating a list of some mock foods. Now, next week, rather than populating hard coding an array in, we're going to query, we're going to query the database. We want to get our list of foods from MongoDB. We're just mocking this today. So then I've got my component. And what I want to do in here now is make this list available in my component. So I'm just going to initialize the mock list of foods. So what we'll do this in here. We'll create a variable called foods. And set it equal. So now our mock list is available inside our component using the variable name foods. Now this is going to break my front end because my HTML page, it's looking for food item.name. We no longer have food item. So we actually get an error. It doesn't show an error in the browser, but that value, my code editor is saying, yeah, I don't know what this is anymore. Okay, so create your array. It's a constant. And typically we write constants in all caps. And then we're creating a corresponding list inside of our component. So now what I want to do, before we were just displaying the one food item, I want to use a loop, an Angular loop structure that will display our list of foods. So I'm going to go back to my food component. And I'm going to replace what's there. I'm going to use a UL. And there, I believe there's a class called maybe not. We'll see what's in our see if there's any sort of UL definition in here. Okay, well, maybe I won't worry about it too much for now. And then we're going to use an Angular loop structure. So it's going to look like this. So inside the LI, we use star ng4. So what we want to use is let food of foods. That's the structure with Angular. So foods represents our variable in our component, and we're going to call each individual item in there food. And inside our list, we may want to change the CSS. So now we can use handlebars to print our food, but name. So this should, not sure what the CSS is going to look like, this should create a list and display 3 LI sets of LI tags where we're showing each food name. So this is what we get when we do that. So our component has a list of 3 items, and our Angular ng4 is looping through and displaying those items. So we don't have a for each structure in Angular. We have this star ng4. I'll maybe make a comment here. Food is so foods, list of foods in the component, food, current item in the loop. Just going to do a quick check of my HTML here to my CSS. So what we want to do, one other thing I want to do, is I want to build a little form down below that when we click on one of these items, it will populate the ID, the name, and the country automatically. Okay, so we're going to build a form. The form is hidden unless the user clicks on a food. And when they click on a food, it populates that form. And again, this is all going to happen with JavaScript in the client, so our page doesn't need to get reloaded. The card container, you're thinking for the UL? Okay, class equals. Okay, and then I probably need, if that's the case, a card. Let's see what that looks like. Okay. I just need to get rid of my bullets. T-Boy, I don't know who you are. Who are you? I don't recognize your name from your YouTube name. I guess I can also go back and look at the app.component because it had those cards. So maybe I'll look at that class to clean it up. So in our app component.html, let's see, we had. Oh, I don't think they used a UL, so that's why. So I could probably just change this to maybe to a div. Same here, to a div, perhaps. Right, so that gets rid of the bullets. It's not really a list, it's just a series of cards. So we have our container. Thank you for the CSS tip, I appreciate it. And then we'll use a span for the class of cards. So when I click one, which also, that card class also makes it look like a link, I want to have the form below show up. Ah, thanks, Tolu. So now down below here, I'm going to create, maybe I'll create a section. And in here, I'll put in an H2 that says food details. And we'll create just a basic form, just straight HTML first, and then we'll add the Angular code after. This should take us, I'd say, we probably have about 10 minutes left in today's lesson. So I'm going to create 3 field sets. And I'll create an input. Actually, just going to put a blank input for now. Second field set with a label that says name. Empty input. A third one, label, says country. For country for today, we're just going to make it a regular text input. We won't worry about making it a drop down. We don't actually need any button here. So there's our HTML. And what we want is when the user clicks on any food, Angular will automatically populate the form. If we change the form, the list will automatically change in real time. So I'll leave the HTML up for a minute. You apologize for helping? Yeah, never apologize for that. Okay, so there's our form. So what we're going to need to do is go and modify our component a little bit. We have a foods property, our list that's populated. We also want to set up a selected food property. So if we click on any one of the cards, we know what got clicked on. Yeah, my form doesn't look very good right now. Probably should add some spacing to the labels. But we want to also populate the form. So I'm going to go back to my food component. I guess we could also add Bootstrap to this if we wanted to. There may be something here to set the width of the label, or I guess I could always define a label myself. I'm just going into the food component. We'll maybe set the label width at, I don't know, 75 pixels. That should align our form. It doesn't tell me. Okay, I may have to come back to that. I'm not sure why that didn't update our labels exactly, but we'll leave that for now. So I'm going to go back to my food component. So we've got a foods list. I now want a selected food property. And this is going to be of type food. So this is a single food, not a list. And then I'm going to add a method in here called onSelect. And this method, we can see TypeScript, it's strongly typed. We are passing in a food object. Our method is void, it doesn't return anything. We're going to say this.selected food equals the food parameter. And it's not liking the white space here, so I'll remove it. So we're setting up a selected food parameter. Selected food property. And here we are set the selected food property equal to the food the user clicked in the UI. If they click fish tacos, selected food becomes this element. If they click sushi, it becomes this element. If they click bibimbap, it becomes this element. So we're going to need to more Angular code in our UI to display the selected food in the form. So I've added lines 26 to 31 in the Angular food component. So we're going to need to add some code to our cards, as well as some code to our form. So I'm going to go back to my HTML, and I want to add to my cards, I want to add an Angular click handler. So here's what this looks like. So in my span tag, I'm going to write a clicks. And notice this is different than a JavaScript. It's not on click. We use round brackets, and WebStorm's telling me this is an Angular event. So in round brackets, click equals, in this case, our click is going to call the method in our component that we just wrote. So it's going to call our onSelect, and we are passing in this case, current food. So when we click any card, we will pass in that food object to the component. The other thing we want to do is we want to hide this entire form. We shouldn't even see this area until an item is clicked. So Angular has a really simple way to show or hide. So in our section, we use a star, and we use ngIf. And what we can check with ngIf is if there is a selected food. So if this property has a value, it means make this tag visible. If there is no selected food, this whole tag will be hidden. So when I save that and jump back, we have no selected food, so it's not visible. As soon as I click something, my form comes back because now the selected food has been set. Now, we could also maybe add a reset button here that would remove the selected food, that would hide the form. So maybe in here, I'll also add a button that has a click event. You can try it this way. Equals, we could say onSelect. See what happens if we pass in null. And don't put in the word food : here. This is just a parameter prompt from WebStorm. It should just say onSelect null. So I'm going to try and see if we make selected food equal to null, that should then hide our form, because the form only shows when there is a selected food. We'll try that. Oh, my button does need text, but it does work. My button says hide or reset. So now it goes away. Just looking if there was a simple class I could apply to my button. I'll leave it for now. Okay, so when we click, we get our form. But the other thing we want to do is we want to populate our form. So fish tacos is the selected food. So how do I render the ID, the name, and the country into the corresponding inputs? So we need a few more Angular directives. So in my input here, we're going to set up our two-way data binding. And the directive we're going to use is ngModel. This allows us to connect one of the properties in our Angular component to this specific input. So our ngModel, in this case, is going to be our selected food dot ID. Now it's complaining. It's saying we can't use ngModel we need to include a reference to the Angular Forms library. Now, WebStorm is great for this. It tells me when I'm missing a reference. So if I look at my food component, it is not using the Angular Forms module. So I'm going to accept that. Sorry, where's my app component.ts? So if we look here, we don't have the form module here either, but I'm going to accept that suggestion. So if I click import forms module, my error goes away. And if I look at my food component, actually, we don't see it in the food component. We now see it here. So in app-module.ts, in the main TypeScript setup file, it's now added line 7. I could add this manually, so you may not have gotten that code prompt. If you haven't gotten that code prompt, you want to jump to your app.module.ts, and you need line 7 and line 17. So line 7, you need to import the forms module, and you need to import and declare it on line 17 as well. So reference the library and import it. So ng model is specifically used for HTML forms. So I can't use that ng model property on my input if I don't import the forms module. If you're using something like Visual Studio Code, it may not have given you that warning that WebStorm gave me. So again, line 7 in app.module.ts and line 17. So now my ng model shows up, and I'm going to set up also the two-way data binding. My second input box will be bound to the selected food.name. And my third is going to be bound to selected food country. So now if I click any one of the cards at the top, my form should appear and my 3 inputs will be populated. Let's try this out. So when I click my first element, everything shows up. And as soon as I hide or reset the form, my form goes away. So because I'm using these ng model tags, these inputs are now bound to the corresponding properties of my selected food that we've declared in our component. So our selected food is of type food, and our food model has an ID, a name, and a country. So we can see things are changing. Our page is not reloading. Angular handles everything. And now, here's one of the other neat things. Notice if I change the food name, notice what's happening in the card up here. It actually is changing up here as well. So this is the two-way data binding in action. Now, it's not saving these things permanently, but as I change, as I type, things change here. So there's our two-way data binding that we talked about earlier. The UI is constantly checking, is the model, and that's what our ng model tags are representing, our model. Is this UI representing the latest data? So as I type in the name, we can see the cards changing up above in real time. So that's really part of the power of Angular, that our data is displayed in real time. The user doesn't have to send a request to the server or refresh the page in order for that to happen. Okay. Now, if I refresh the entire thing, obviously we've hard-coded into our component these values, so those values won't persist if I do actually reload the page. Now, there are a couple of other CSS cleanup items I'm going to do on here. So I want to space these out properly, as well as style my button. I guess I could give those, we'll see if I give them my own class. Maybe I'll make a BTN class. I'll see if I can define that in my style sheet. If I make it blue with white, a bold white font, see if that, yep, so I get my blue text. Maybe I'll add some padding. Button a little bigger. Maybe shrink that down to, I don't know, 10 pixels. And I'll change this class of .lbl, and then I'll apply this class to my 3 labels, so they should be all the same width. I'm not exactly sure why my label's not working. My label widths. Any ideas from anybody why my label widths are not all setting to a standard width? I'm not entirely sure about this. Okay, well, maybe what I do, before I push this up to GitHub, I will fix my CSS problem here so that this looks a little better and my labels are showing at a standard width. So I'll fix that before I push to GitHub. So there's our Angular lesson for today. So next week's lesson is probably going to be longer because we're going to do, at the very least, we want to integrate this into a new Node Express Mongo application where we can, at the very least, do add and read if we don't have, and hopefully we have time. I may make the lesson longer just so that we can cover all of edit and delete. We're going to have to write quite a bit of code to do that. But the end product will be a pretty good user experience where they can manage all their data on a single page without refreshing. Thank you, Sukhpreet and Envy. Yes, much better. Thanks, guys. Thank you for the suggestion. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to push everything up to GitHub. Again, if you want an office hours appointment for today, just send me a meeting request through the Outlook calendar. And I'm happy to meet through WebEx. You can share your screen with me if you're having trouble, and we can work through it. So next week, we will start at 9 again. And also, if you have any questions about the upcoming tutorials, please send me a message, or we can set up a WebEx meeting. Keep working on assignment 2, and again, remember, quiz by midnight tonight, and I will be distributing out the assignment 2 part 1 plans, so that with some instructions for lab 3 as to how you are to provide feedback to your partner. So that's all for today. If I don't speak to you, have a good week, and I'm available pretty much all week for help or questions. Okay, anything else? I'll just hang on for a minute. Anything else before I sign off for now? Okay, I'm not seeing any comments. So I'll sign off. And as I said, feel free to reach out with anything you want to talk about or need help with today. Thanks. Have a good day, everyone.